Welcome to the Voice of Liberty podcast. I'm sitting with Libertarian POTUS candidate, Kim Ruff. Kim, good evening.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on the show. So we're going to dive right into some fun little questions here. These questions are going to remain the same for all POTUS candidates that are going to come on the show. Just as a shameless plug here, a couple upcoming candidates include Ken Armstrong, Adam Kokesh, and Dan Berman. But we're starting this off with Kim. We're very excited to have her here, so let's roll right into tax stances, one of our favorite topics of discussion.
Okay, you just want to know my general position on taxes?
What your position on taxes is, what you're going to do as president to improve the amount of taxes we're paying / eliminate some of the taxes that we're paying and some of the wasteful taxing that's going on. And also, are you going to repair the situation that exists where we have taxation without representation?
Okay. All right. Well, that's a lot of stuff to unpack. Generally speaking, as libertarians, obviously, we're vehemently opposed to taxation because the whole premise hinges on the concept that it is totally permissible to take someone's property and redistribute it using the government middleman. And of course, everything that government does comes at the force or threat of force. If you don't pay your taxes, you will lose property. If you don't pay your taxes, you will be put in prison. These are the consequences and repercussions of not permitting the government to take taxes from you. So we're opposed to that, obviously. And then we do currently live in a culture where the tax burden is about 30 to 50% when you think about income and sales and property, estate, every other taxation that you have to do, it adds up. So you have a situation where somebody works and they get a gross amount of profit for their labor, but then they're only permitted to take home a small portion of it. And then they go to the grocery store and they pay sales tax there. They own a home, they pay a property tax there. So we're continually taking this money, having the government determine what agencies and what organizations or programs they go to, rather than permitting the individual to make the determination about what they want to spend their money on, thereby contributing to the economy that way. So what we'd ideally like to see is a massive overall reduction and ultimately an end of taxation altogether. People should voluntarily choose where their money goes and how their money is spent and to whom is the recipient. So as a president, there is only a small amount that I could actually control with respect to taxation because that's something that's determined by the legislature. However, I do have a very delicious fantasy, which is when I do get elected, I would love to go in my first congressional address and basically say, you're all on notice until you can come up with a balanced budget that not only either holds steady or reduces the overall tax burden that's applied to society, but you have to come up with not only a balanced budget, but then make inroads towards paying down our national deficit, which is now holding steady at about 23 trillion. Until you can do that, I'm not going to approve anything that you guys do. You have a fiduciary duty to the people that you're representing to do right by them. And you haven't been since pretty much time immemorial. So that would be something where I could put them on notice and then not approve any budget that they put forth or any legislation that would propose to take more from people in their area. But most of the taxes that you end up paying are typically at the local or state level. So it's incumbent upon people at those levels to push on their representatives and make sure that they are adequately represented. These issues are addressed and dealt with. Now, insofar as taxation without representation, that is a whole other can of worms. And that gets into things like gerrymandering, and as far as how we determine representational structure, that's a whole different thing. And that I think we'll put a pin in that one for now and probably have to discuss that in a lengthy paper. But yeah, that's definitely the situation we're in. And that's obviously the impetus behind the Revolutionary War as well as the Civil War. So
yes. Awesome. That's a really nice in-depth answer. That's a lot to unpack for the viewers.
Yeah, right.
Moving forward, I recently had a right-wing, best way to describe him is a political advocate on the show. He was the first person to be on the show, and we discussed foreign policy stances with him, and he adamantly defended us having certain foreign bases, but also did agree to remove certain ones. We also discussed, how to draw back troops from these illegal wars that we are in. And so now let's throw that question at you. Foreign policy, as far as our bases overseas go, are any of our bases that we have overseas actually worthwhile, or should we completely remove those bases from overseas? And as far as current illegal wars and military operations going on, are you for an immediate withdrawal of troops from those areas, or do you want to slowly bring them back and slowly work to eliminate how many troops we have in these foreign nations?
Okay. So the first question you asked was, is there any sort of justification to maintain bases overseas, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So to answer that, basically, it really comes down to what's your foreign policy approach. If you are of the mindset that it is in our best interest to have a presence in different parts of the world and that we are responsible for policing the world's affairs, then I suppose you could justify the existence of these bases overseas and you could justify them in certain strategic locations. However, as libertarians, we are vehemently opposed to interventionism. Now, we're firmly, I want to make something clear to some of your viewers who aren't libertarian because it's something that they get hung up on. We are not isolationist. We absolutely understand the fact that we live in an international climate, an international world, and engage in an international economy. We recognize that we deal with people in foreign nations all the time, and a lot of that has come as a result of this burgeoning in technology and communication that allows us to bridge that gap. And we're better for it. But for us to take the tack that we somehow have the moral high ground or the ethical responsibility to manage and engage in the affairs of other nation states and the individuals therein is totally antithetical to our belief system. So there is no moral justification for us to maintain 800 overseas bases in 70 different countries. As far as whether or not we would scale it back gradually as opposed to do an immediate full stop, my feeling on it is it's a cycle of abuse, and it's been perpetuated since the exit of World War II. I mean, our entire foreign policy approach post World War II was to stop to curb the Soviet threat. So every single move we made in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, South America, it was always in the design to prevent the Soviet Union from becoming the more potent or powerful global hegemon, because really the two victors of that war were the United States and the Soviet Union.
Correct.
So we spent the entire Cold War up until the 9/11 effectively trying to stop that. And in so doing, we took the tack that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And we provided financial and material aid to rebel groups and organizations just because we wanted to get rid of whoever was currently in power or upset or destabilize the region. And in so doing, fostered a much worse climate. We created a power vacuum that manifested in worse character actors coming to light, and thus 9/11. That is, as Ron Paul so succinctly said, blowback for us meddling in the Middle East. So if we want to get to a point where we want to have a healthy international climate, it behooves us to stop that now. Bring our troops back home now. There's no reason for us to be in South Korea or in the Middle East or any other region of the world. And certainly not Italy. I mean, what the hell is going down in Italy? Give me a break. I mean, granted, if you're an F-16 pilot, that's a pretty cherry place to get stationed. But let's be real, there's nothing going on there. So we need to bring them back home. Besides, if you think about it, if the most important thing to us as Americans is making sure that we have a healthy, strong economy, why are we sending so much of our intellectual capital overseas? Which is what we do when we send our troops. And then we bring them back and they're shattered and devastated from their experiences if they're fortunate enough to survive. What better way to improve our economy and build a healthier international climate than to end these wars and bring our troops back home?
Okay. If I can just expand on that a little bit, as far as the Middle East goes, because there are some out there that argue that if we do a rapid withdrawal from the Middle East, we will create a vacuum with which could be filled by groups like ISIS, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and any multitude of other terrorist organizations that you want to name. It's a concern that I've had personally, and it's one of those things that I still struggle with as a libertarian. What is the best route to go? What's your stance on that type of thing?
Well, let's look at it this way. We invaded Iraq in 2005. And I believe we ended that war in 2017, if I'm correct.
Mhm.
Now, whereas Afghanistan, we started that in 2003, and we are still doing that. That's been going on longer than Vietnam. Both those regions, even though we engaged in extended nation building, which is something a military is not trained to do, both those regions are incredibly hostile and incredibly unstable. So whether we stay there for a minute or we stay there for years, it's not going to change that reality. And the longer we stay there, don't you think that fosters dependence on the United States being there? How are we supposed to ensure that other people find that strength within and stabilize their own region, fight against these corrupt powers, if we're constantly holding their hand and essentially doing what welfare does to people domestically?
Yeah.
If there is going to be an upset in a nation state, then shouldn't that nation state sort that out on their own without intervention? That's for their people to do. That's for them to determine and decide.
And that's a tactful answer. I actually never kind of looked at it from the idea of fostering dependence on us. And yeah, that actually does make total sense. I love how you stated they've been in turmoil for years, and you know, we're just adding to it. It does make sense. So there's been a lot of talk in the news regarding WikiLeaks, regarding whistleblowers, regarding people who have taken the ultimate step of bravery to warn the American people that something is wrong. So what I want to move into is talking about two of the most prominent ones that are out there, besides Julian Assange, and that I wanted to go towards Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. Edward Snowden took massive risk to give us an idea of what was going on within the NSA and how our government is spying on us illegally. Is he someone that deserves a full presidential pardon? And would you be someone to support, pardoning him completely, giving him an opportunity to come back home and actually take what he's given us and help the American people dismantle this system of spying on us?
Yes, and yes, absolutely. No, well, I mean, one of the most important things is that, we talk about how there's the three branches of the federal government. And then we that the journalism, mainstream media is the fourth estate, that they have a responsibility to tell the truth and make sure that the public is informed. But obviously they're bought and sold, and they're very much in the hands of those that are in power. So us as individuals, really, I would say arguably are the fourth estate. It's our duty that when we see something, we say something. We don't see something, say something to the NSA type, see something, say something. I mean, when we see something, say something, we have a duty to make it known. If we see that there's unethical practices in a business that we're working in, we have a duty to the other people to ensure their safety and well-being, that we report it. And if we see that our government, which is the greatest violator of rights, engaging in these behaviors that put people at extraordinary risk or harm, we have a duty to say so. And I think that what they did was incredibly brave. I absolutely agree with you. And I do believe that Edward Snowden, actually, he wasn't the first person who blew the lid off of the NSA doing warrantless wiretapping. It's just that us, the sleeping giant of the human electorate, was just like, oh, what's this about restrooms? So, like we get distracted by something minor as opposed to actually recognizing it. So we kind of forgot about it until he did it. But yes, what he did is absolutely necessary. And I think being punitive to him only discourages American people from doing the right thing. So yes, absolutely a full pardon for him, as well as for Chelsea Manning and anyone else guilty of such quote unquote crimes. So
I like how you put that. And my mistake there, I actually did not realize that Edward Snowden wasn't the first one to blow the lid off the NSA, and that's a point of poor research on my part.
No, don't feel bad. A lot of folks think that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he is by far the most well known, and it was significant to us as a public because they actually went after him.
Yeah.
They actively pursued him, and I just think the other one got kind of buried on page 6.
Gotcha.
So that's not your fault at all. I was surprised myself.
So moving forward, there's been a lot of talk in, both localities, states, and even now starting at the national level pertaining to legalization and or decriminalization of weed. But as libertarians, a lot of us I'd say venture off to say 90% of our party believes that legalizing just weed doesn't go far enough. That Peru-style legalization and decriminalization is more closely recommended by the whole party. What is your stance on legalization of drugs in general? And we already know weed is not a drug, but we have to refer to it that way.
Yeah, well, as you know, in the background with respect to us criminalizing marijuana, that came down to an economic matter. That was because there was a big conflict between hemp and paper. In the paper industry, it was a conflict between using trees, which DuPont, who had relationship with the Treasury, had just invented a new chemical in order to be used in that process of turning wood pulp into paper, and hemp, which grows much faster and is very much a renewable resource, much like bamboo, was in direct competition. So since they couldn't exactly just say, like, we'll make hemp illegal, they decided to focus on THC, marijuana, and go after that. And then, of course, at the time, they played upon the hysterical racism of our culture, and they're like, this makes white women listen to jazz music and hang out with African American men, and people are like, oh no, we need to get rid of it. So that's sort of the basis for how marijuana became illegal. And the same thing happened with respect to heroin and other opioids. That happened because we were targeting the Chinese, who were instrumental in building the railroads. It was competitive, and we went after them and said, oh, they just use a bunch of opioids, so make those illegal to penalize them. A lot of the stuff that we did was either for economic gain or because we were just inherently racist in our thinking. So it has no moral basis. I mean, it's couched as we're trying to protect you, we're trying to care for you, but even the sentencing structure that we use is inherently biased and racist. It penalizes lower socioeconomic classes and minorities disproportionately more than it penalizes people who are wealthier or white. So that's kind of the background on it. Now, as far as libertarians go, we are absolutely proponents of ending the drug war, full stop, and decriminalizing and or legalizing narcotics. Not because we think that it should be one wonderful free-for-all, but rather because we are of the opinion that you, as one of your core rights, is property rights, and property is your body and the fruits of your labor. Bodily autonomy says that you have the right to do with your body what you will, provided you harm nobody else. And truly, that's your prerogative if you want to use drugs. Of course, the other thing is that ending the war on drugs would end up eliminating the black market. Much as we saw with the prohibition of alcohol, we had a rise in the black market, a rise in organized crime, and all of that came about because there was still that desire to have it. In fact, maybe more so because it was forbidden. And we can get rid of that entirely. So we absolutely do believe in that. Although I personally do not like any system that would manifest in government controlling licenses or fees or making determinations about the quality or efficacy of any narcotics, because I think that basically just turns around and becomes another money-making scheme for the government as opposed to permitting true, legitimate bodily autonomy. So.
Very well argued. Now, within some parties, and we won't name specific parties, but there are some parties out there that argue that by doing a full stop legalization of every single drug out there, we are going to become this country that's overrun with drug users and drug abusers. Are you of that belief? Do you follow that, that presumption that that is what is going to happen? Or have you looked at other countries which have done the exact same thing that we argue for? And do you argue that that would occur here, where drug usage actually went down, where drug-related deaths went down, drug-related crime went down? Do you 100% believe that will occur here in America?
No, because the statistics and the experiences don't bear out. In other countries where they have decriminalized or legalized narcotics, you might have an initial period of time where people utilize them just because of the availability, but invariably that goes by the wayside. And in fact, they're more likely to not do it at all. I mean, think about it from this perspective. If we took out the stigma of narcotics and we simply looked at it like a matter of looking at, say, produce, or, over-the-counter medication, Do you find yourself abusing Tylenol because you can get it? You can just walk into a CVS and get it? No, you use it when you want to use it, and that's it. And then it stays in the medicine cabinet until it expires. And that's the same thing about pretty much anything that's truly readily available.
Yes.
I know from my own experience, if a heroin was suddenly legal or methamphetamines were suddenly legal, I wouldn't turn around and go buy some. I wouldn't be like, yeah, I was just waiting for this. I don't want to do it. It's not for me. I think that really it's the stigmatization and the fact that we look at it from that perspective that makes it alluring. When something is forbidden, it's way more interesting than something that's just everyday and commonplace. So I don't think that it would be the sudden influx of people doing it. I don't think that we'd have bigger problems. And I think it would take a lot of the stigma out, and people who were really struggling with addiction would be a lot more inclined to deal with it head on, rather than feeling like they needed to hide it because it is illegal.
Well argued. I love the Tylenol stance there, because that's actually one that I've actually never heard used, but it's such a true example. I don't think I've really ever heard of someone abusing Tylenol. So, and if they have, there's something else wrong.
I'm all strung out on acetaminophen.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm gonna have a long weekend.
That's an interesting one. So moving right along, as a libertarian myself, I believe in the strength of the Constitution. I believe what the Constitution says. And within the Constitution right now, the number one amendment of the Constitution, the number one right that is signified within the Constitution that is being questioned right now, especially on the Democratic ticket right now, is our Second Amendment rights. Just last night in the Democratic debates, there was multiple points where the topic of assault weapons came up, and where the topic of gun laws and gun restrictions and gun bans came up. What is your stance on the Second Amendment? Are you a Second Amendment purist, or do you take another stance on the Second Amendment?
Oh, I'm very much a purist. Absolutely. Of course, just for people who are listening who may not be libertarian and may not be cognizant of this, because we are adherents to natural rights, of which there are only three: life, liberty, and justly acquired property. We believe that you have your right to do with your rights what you will. The rejoinder to that, though, is that if someone violates your rights or harms you, you have a right to self-defense, of which firearms or any other means of protection are absolutely necessary. And the biggest violator of those rights is government, just because of the fact that it accomplishes nothing of its own. So it has to rely on force in order to compel society to comply. So absolutely, I'm a proponent of firearms and gun rights and the ability for individuals to bear arms. And I don't take any shades of gray, because I think this is something that's non-negotiable. It's interesting, we were just talking about narcotics and how those came to be illegal in the first place. This whole thing about the Second Amendment, of all the different amendments in the Bill of Rights, this was the one that was like least challenged up until the 60s, when the Black Panthers started to exercise their constitutional rights. And then Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, took the tack that basically we need to stop these Negroes from being armed and make it illegal. And from there, that's become this overarching thing that's somehow touted by both Republicans and Democrats. We need gun control. We need gun control. No, we don't need gun control. We need government control. That's the problem. And this is something that we really need to tackle, and we need to address, and we need to make sure that we have candidates who are willing to state this and not be shy about it. I'm not sorry that I want to defend myself.
Now, within the Second Amendment, me personally as a libertarian, I have said this multiple times, and I usually, through this, am able to unite the left and the right in hating me by saying this, but I am a huge proponent of eliminating any registration, any type of licensing, any type of way that the government could know what guns I have, and any way that they could know that I have these things in preparation for if the government were to become tyrannical. Do you support removing licensing, registration, anything like that, and taking the Second Amendment back to the way it should be?
I absolutely am. I completely agree with that. And it's from the perspective of, it's like this. You know how we talk about the locked door and we talk about that being a deterrent, which is if somebody's hell bent on breaking in, they'll break in. But a locked door or an alarm system, even if it's not abled, or just the reality that somebody might have the means of protecting themselves and you don't know to what extent they could protect themselves, makes you a heck of a lot less inclined to violate their rights. So when the government has a registry of all the firearms you own, then they know exactly what they're going up against. I'm not okay with that. I would like to know that if somebody broke into my home, whether it was just an individual who lived next door to me, or if it was a member of the state who was targeting me for whatever reason, that I would have an arsenal and I wouldn't have to worry about them knowing exactly how to fight me. Like, if everybody knows your moves, you don't have any defense. So yes, I think that we should get rid of registration as well.
Now, I feel like I'm going to be harping on the Second Amendment for a few here, but it is a very, very important topic as of right now. One of the things that you generally get from people that don't understand why we argue for having these weapons in case the government becomes tyrannical is that they state that we have no chance against the U.S. military. They seem to forget what the U.S. military swears an oath to when arguing from this point, but then they argued from the point of the U.S. military has far superior weapons to what any individual can get. I myself believe that we should have access to the very weaponry they have. That was how it started with the Second Amendment, and that's how it should be today. Do you agree with that stance?
I do.
Okay. So the last part, and this is really where I wanted to get to with this, is because so many people have a misunderstanding. When we argue in this belief that we should have the same weaponry the federal government has, or rephrase that, the military, then they seem to divulge into all these weapons that the military has that they shouldn't have. Their favorite one, nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And this is where I just want to throw you on the spot for a second. I argue from the stance that we should not have a lot of the weapons we have because they are not really good for defensive war, which is the only purpose that we should be going to war. What is your stance on that?
Well, usually when people talk about things like nuclear weapons, because that's like the nuclear option as far as that particular discussion is concerned, you usually say, well, if you're not comfortable with the concept of your neighbor having a nuclear weapon, notwithstanding the fact that uranium and plutonium are very expensive to get, and good luck to them if they can, I guess, like property rights and mining and whatnot. But yeah, notwithstanding that fact, like if you're not comfortable with the idea of your neighbor having a nuclear arsenal, what makes you okay with the concept of a group of people wearing funny hats and funny badges having access to those weapons either? What makes them somehow more responsible than the person who lives next door to you? This is the thing that's always weird to me, is that people seem perfectly content to allow government, because they put it in this position of being this just almost godlike entity, not recognizing that it's comprised of knuckleheads like you and me. And they think, oh, it's totally okay for them to have access to this, and that it's totally okay for us to do things on an international stage using these things, but it's not okay for you. That's bizarre. So if you're not comfortable with it in that context, you shouldn't be comfortable with it ever. And in fact, to make something perfectly clear, because this is something that's brought up oftentimes, like, what about this threat of nuclear warfare with other countries? I would like to remind other people that the only country that has ever deployed nukes was us.
Yep.
Nobody else has ever discharged a nuclear weapon but us.
And it should also be clear that we didn't even use our nukes in a defensive situation. It was completely offensive, what we did with those, which further proves the point. They are not a defensive weapon.
Right.
The only time that nukes have ever been claimed to be defensive was with the mutually assured destruction that we had with Russia. That's
right,
the
like
only time it ever would have been defensive, and we'd all be dead anyway.
Right, like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Correct.
Right.
Exactly. So moving right along, I wanted to really kind of make this a little more personal here. What qualifies you to be the president of the United States? And I want to kind of jump a little further into this. there are a lot of people out there on the left who may view this, and they may skip over everything about you and vote for you just because you're a woman. And then there are people on the right that may avoid the topic completely of voting for you because you're a woman. There seems to be stigma of this. What personal characters make you the person that should be the president of the United States?
Okay. Well, to be clear, nobody is fit to be the president of the United States. This is the truth. No one is fit to rule over you. No one is fit to make determinations about how you live your life. No one is equipped better than you to make those decisions. So that's something that we really want to impress upon people, is that no one should be doing this role. This is something that you are perfectly capable of doing. However, we are far afield because of the fact that this governmental system exists, and because of the fact that we are going to have to deal with it for quite some time as we disentangle it from all of our lives. We are going to have to elect representatives. And I think the thing that would be most important above all else is integrity. I think that's something that we don't look for in candidates anymore. We look for charisma, which is a nice thing to have, sure, but that means nothing if that person doesn't have integrity. You have to feel and know that the person is speaking the truth, that they have conviction, that they have a moral compass, and that they will conduct themselves with integrity and adhere to ethics. That's hugely important, and that's something that I strive to do in every facet of my life. Now, I am human. I make mistakes. But the nice thing, I guess, about being a human being and going through this process of living life is that when you make mistakes and you recognize that you have made them, you take ownership of it, and you are appropriately contrite, and you make amends in whatever way you can while mitigating harm. That's part of being a human being and living this life. So that's a certain aspect of it. Insofar as experience or professionalism, I suppose to some extent the fact that I've been an activist in the Libertarian Party for 10 years and have been actively fighting this fight in various facets should be indicia of my commitment to what we're trying to accomplish here, as well as the fact that I'm an operations director for a manufacturing plant. And because I'm second in command and I have to make daily decisions regarding production and deal with the chaos of working in manufacturing, I think I'm pretty well equipped to deal with things of that nature. So, but above and all else, the women thing, the woman thing. I'm sorry, that just
I have to touch on it just because last night during the Democratic debates, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, and I believe Tulsi and I can't think of the other lady's name, they all seemingly at some point touched on the fact that, hi, I'm a woman, I can do this, vote for me. And it leads back to that problem that I've always had with voting, where people vote based upon character trait or character traits, not who they are.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is something that's kind of interesting for all of us as libertarians, because I think most of us eschew identity politics. Like, we find it something just very cringy. Are they intelligent? Are they articulate? Do they have morals? Like, these are huge things for us, not what gender they are or what sex assignment they are, or whatever the case may be. Like, that's irrelevant. You just want a decent person to do decent things. We focus on the individual. We don't collectivize. However, unfortunately, statistically speaking, this is the reality of the world that we live in, is that identity politics are relevant. People look at candidates and they see normative representation. There are going to be women who will look at me and, just by the mere fact that I am a woman, feel like they're getting more represented than perhaps a man would. Or there might be men who find me appealing, maybe not now because I just took a shower and I'm not wearing makeup, but there might be men who only choose me because they might be attracted to me. These things are relevant, albeit ridiculous. So I would hope that when people look at me as a candidate, they listen to what I say and find that it resonates with them. They read what I write and they hear the truth. They feel that I'm a person who tries to be honest and I'm authentic and real and I do the best I can and I have a firm commitment to these things that I believe in. I would hope that that would be the issues that were most important to them. But there's still going to be people who are going to vote for me just because I'm a woman, or won't vote for me because of that. So I think I did lose the MGTOW vote. I don't think those guys are on my side. But you do you, boo. I'm okay with them. going their own way. That's the whole thing about freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So moving into some of the more hot button issues in the Libertarian Party right now, one of the big ones is sex workers' rights. And I really want to hear where you stand on their rights, where you stand on legalization of what they do, and just your entire, I guess, opinion on the situation.
Okay. Well, I'm very much a proponent of sex workers' rights. I think that just like any other individual who engages in a perfectly fine and totally harmless economic exchange, they have rights just like everybody else. And I think the fact that we have allowed our puritanical roots to marginalize and castigate an entire subsection of humanity simply because they choose to use their body for economic exchange is a horrific crime. I mean, basically, you have to value a society by how they treat you have to look at a society by how they treat everyone. And if we have entire groups of people that have been marginalized simply because of what they choose to do, which is not unethical, it's not unethical to, again, with bodily autonomy, to use your body for economic exchange or just simply for your own pleasure, whatever the case may be. If we mistreat those people, we marginalize them, then how can we ever say that we're truly decent people? So I think the sex worker thing, the fact that we even still today are so hesitant to discuss it is weird. Like, you don't have to be a sex worker. You don't have to patronize a sex worker.
Correct.
You don't have to be even comfortable with the concept personally. But that doesn't make it permissible for you to use government to penalize people who are engaging in nothing harmful. That's absurd. And all these arguments about trying to protect them or how it's a feminist issue. No, a woman who uses her body how she wants to use her body is truly being a feminist, not someone who's saying that you're objectifying or marginalizing women because you choose to use your body for sex. So I'm very much a proponent of sex worker rights, and I'm not afraid to say it.
Awesome. And so I have to harken back to the first person I had on this show. And the only reason I have to harken back to him because they said one word that absolutely just pokes me the wrong way. Regulation. Should there be any government regulation of the idea of sex work if it is legalized? Or should the government just stay the heck out of it and focus on doing what it needs to do that it is constitutionally mandated to do?
Oh my gosh, this is so funny to me. Hell no. No, of course not. I mean, think about it like this. If you're a sex worker, say you're a prostitute, because there are various different types of sex workers, like a stripper qualifies as a sex worker. Yep. A porn actress qualifies as a sex worker. If you think about anyone who engages as like an actual prostitute, their product is their body. What they're selling to the consumer is their body. It behooves them to have a superior product and or service and to be competitive in this climate to take good care of their body. So sex workers, by and large, are actually healthier, get tested more often, take better care of themselves than your average layperson who's given away for free. So regulation is only about pocketing more money, about controlling more of people's lives. There's no rational reason to regulate that industry, just as there's no rational reason to regulate any industry. A business that wants to be successful will do a good job and take good care and have a superior product and service, period. Otherwise, they're going to fail.
Perfect. And that is an unbelievable response to it. It's actually a approach I have never heard before. Me, myself, as a libertarian, I am still very new to the whole sex workers' rights thing. I'm still venturing into it and learning how to argue it. And I owe it personally to someone that's on my committee who is a legal sex worker that I even knew about the topic. So
oh yeah,
that's an awesome approach to it. I really like that. I guess I'm going to sidetrack from what I had written because I realized I missed something that is really important to me. It's something that I personally have been advocating for since I was, able to understand what the term was. And it's actually what drove me out of the Republican Party to become a libertarian. And that is the rights of the LGBTQ community. I have been an ally of them my whole life, I have advocated for them to have the right to live and to not have the government interfere at all with how they are. Your stances on that? Do you want to remove the government 110% from that, just like we have talked about with everything else? And the only reason I ask that is because there are people that I have heard debating removing the government from our lives, and then the moment you mention LGBT rights, all of a sudden it's like, well, I want the government involved in that.
Right, like what's good for the goose isn't good for the gander. No, I mean, as advocates for the individual above all else, it's a recognition that you can live your life however you see fit. You can have the kind of relationships you see fit. You can explore kinks or fetishes. You can have atypical or unusual pairings, because it's all just people being people. Provided no one's harming anyone, there's really no reason for the government to be involved at all. So if you want to get married to one or more or many people, that's your prerogative. If you want to adopt children, you should be able to. You want to go into a restaurant and you would like to, and provided, of course, the business would like to have you there, because the thing about freedom is that property rights do trump all.
Correct.
So you want to exist in society, you should be as equally exempt from external restraint as anybody else. And there's no reason for us to penalize that community. They aren't harming anyone.
Awesome. That's a great answer. I love that. Now to the biggest question I have on this entire list. And
you asked me about recreational nukes already.
Well, yeah, that was more of a fun one. Honestly, I can't wait to see who else or what all the other responses to that question are. The biggest question that I have for you is this one: what are the 3 biggest issues facing America, and why?
Goodness. Okay, so it's interesting because this whole time that we've been campaigning, I've been putting on the lens of what does a president do and what's specific to that role. So everything that I talk about is with respect to like foreign policy or war or the economy, things that are of that role. But I suppose if I'm to just think broadly, what's the biggest issues facing Americans right now? I want to say social Marxism is a huge one. And that is this, you've seen this, the Marxists tried to get into mainstream politics at the turn of the 20th century. And when they failed to take a foothold, what they effectively did is they spread and went into academia, the legal system, various other disciplines, and put their dogma out there. And that dogma has been manifesting in public school education. And so you have this whole, and it's in media as well, and you have this whole cultural shift to the left, this kind of destruction and erosion of family. And I don't mean like as the Christian conservatives would define it, but excuse me, I'm still getting over a cold. Let me take a sip of my tea.
By all means.
Okay, so it's sort of manifested in this erosion of relationships, interpersonal relationships, and family and community, and all these beautiful things that we used to have that were effectively our answer for any concerns we had as a people, rather than turning to government and voting to have a representative make those decisions for us. So that is kind of the world that we exist in now, where we have everything so strictly and starkly divided, and where people don't even know what words mean anymore. All of that comes from social Marxism. So it's a huge problem. Excuse me. So that's a big one. And the aspect of that is that because of social Marxism, you have an entire culture of people who have been indoctrinated into this mindset that government is the cure for what ails us, that government is what we need to seek help from for these existential crises. And such as, I'm concerned about homelessness would be a good example. Like most people who see homelessness are like, this is a terrible thing. and we need to do something about it. But rather than doing what we would have historically done, which is go and care for people or contribute at a soup kitchen or help out at a shelter, rather than do those things or even bring somebody into our home, instead we look to government to fix those problems. If we have some sort of concern about something in our lives or our family, our solution now is, rather than turning inward and being introspective or seeking guidance from family or your pastor or whomever, instead we're turning to government to fix those problems. So that's all come about just because of this influx of this social Marxist thought and this concept that has completely destroyed some of these things that are integral to stopping tyranny. So that's like probably the biggest thing I think we're facing right now. And you can see that in politics as how far left they've shifted.
Yes.
I would say the other biggest challenge, of course, pertains to international relations and foreign affairs. I think the fact that we have become an imperialistic and aggressive nation that is involved in so many other countries' affairs has not only created a hostile international climate for us as individuals and as a country, but it's also been incredibly destructive to our economy, save for, of course, the military industrial complex. They're coming in gangbusters, but it's been incredibly terrible in that respect. And I think that it's essentially put us in this situation where we are at constant threat and we live in a fear-based society, and fear is a huge motivator for people to seek more protection from government. So it perpetuates this cycle. So that's something that we definitely need to deal with. We need to end the foreign wars of aggression. We need to bring the troops home. We need to develop a healthier relationship on the international scale. And then I suppose the third thing would be the conclusion of phase 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think that has really rocked us to our core.
That's awesome.
I think that's something we're all sort of reeling from, the fact that Netflix is no longer able to host Daredevil and other shows. So we may not even see them again. I don't know what's going to happen to Jessica Jones. I'm bothered by this. I think America is too.
That is amazing.
No, I was to be serious. I think the third thing, of course, is the erosion of civil liberties and how that manifests in the criminal justice system. But also, seriously, Marvel Cinematic Universe, we need to get on this.
We need to solve that problem right now.
Yeah, that first, then we deal with the other things.
Now, I guess venturing on, continue on the topic, your campaign has been 100% about, awakening people as to what the actual constitutional limitations of the job of president are, and also at the same time trying to awaken people to remember that if you were voted in as president, you're a servant, you're not a leader.
Right.
Your job is to serve the people that voted and didn't vote for you. And do you want to elaborate on like the limitations of being president? Do you want to elaborate on the purpose and the cause of what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. It's actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things I was remarking to John, my running mate, yesterday was that I feel like most of my campaign is basically a protracted civics lesson, like which is, it's unfortunate in a way when you consider how many people really don't have a good understanding what the president does, including people running for president, as we saw from the Democratic debates. So a lot of it is restating to people, like even when they ask me my opinion about stuff, I will absolutely tell them this is the libertarian position, this is what we believe, this is why we believe it. But to be clear, that's not something the president actually deals with. This is about all that they could effectively do in this position, because our founding fathers set it up so that we had 3 distinct branches of the federal government. And they did that so that you couldn't have a radical sea change in ideology massively change the basic structure of our country. And you can see that the changes that we've experienced, they've been over the course of 250 years. This isn't something that happened overnight. We basically put on a lot of weight over time. Now we're trying to shed it. So it's going to be kind of dancing backwards and in heels, essentially, is how we're going to do this. But the president's position is pretty minimal when you consider it. All the president is the head of the executive branch. And for people who are not aware or need a bit of a refresher, the 3 distinct branches of government are the legislature, or Congress, as it's known generally. And then there's the executive branch, and then there's the judicial branch. The purpose of the legislative branch is to create legislation. That is where you have 535 representatives, 435 are in the House, and they're based on different regional districting, and that's where gerrymandering comes in. And then you have 100 senators. Senators are 2 per state. So they make legislation. They make the laws. They set the budget. They decide if we're going to have an act of war. Only Congress can do those things. The president is the head of the executive branch. As the head of the executive branch, the executive is responsible for enforcing legislation. That's all they do. They're not responsible for creating supplemental legislation or ironing out loopholes or areas of that are poorly defined from legislation. Their job is strictly to enforce existing legislation. Now, the president has the power of veto. They can veto legislation. That's true. They can determine to what extent they maybe want to enforce certain legislation, but that's what the executive branch does. The president himself or herself, their role is basically to be a functional figurehead for the country. They're supposed to ensure that they set ambassadors to various countries to work as surrogates on behalf of our country, build those relationships. They're able to make decisions. They're the commander-in-chief of the military, so they make decisions governing that. But they really don't do much above and beyond few very set things. Most of it is handled by the legislature. And then, of course, the judicial branch determines whether or not legislation, whether it's state-based or federal-based, passes the constitutional sniff test. And even that has evolved since our country's inception. So when I try to talk to people about what I'm running for a very specific job that has a very tiny amount of real responsibility and powers. Unlike what we currently do, we assume basically the presidents, they say like, what do they say? Like, you're going to be the leader of the free world. Like, give me a break. That's ridiculous. He's not a god. Okay. Right. You're like, that's absurd. I mean, first of all, there's other countries where they're like, excuse me, like that's rude. But more than that, the president is just responsible for doing a few set things and mostly just being a functional figurehead, much like the chair of a party is, for example, the chair of a committee. A chair is responsible for maybe charting a course or giving speeches and kind of setting the agenda, but it's up to the legislature to make it happen. So that is something that they need to remember. And of course, the other aspect is that you are supposed to have a constitutional government, a constitutional representative. I'm sorry, I'm totally forgetting the word, but it's not a democracy. We don't have a democracy. We have a constitutional republic. Yep. Thank you. Sorry, it like slipped my mind. We live in a constitutional republic. You elect people from your community to represent your interest at a federal level. The president is a representative of the people. If the president is doing a bad job representing you and adhering to the oath of office that he or she takes, then you have an absolute responsibility to impeach that person and replace them with somebody who's a better representative. People forget that. They forget this. They forget that they have so much power at their disposal, that they have a means to fight back. And this is something they need to remember. And the other thing they need to remember is that if we ease their burden, if we reduce the tax burden, if we ease the stressors and the force of government on their lives, they will have so much more opportunity to be involved and participate. I can't tell you how many events I've gone to where people are like, I don't do politics. Well, honey, politics are doing you. Like whether or not you want to do politics, it still affects you. Whether or not you want to pay attention, it's still impacting your life. And is that really what you want to have, is have people make decisions governing your life and you have no way in whatsoever? So it starts with every single one of us. We have to stand up, fight back, be present, pay attention, and always call them out when they end up violating their oath of office or they run roughshod over our rights.
That's an awesome statement right there, and it really does. It's a testament to what we deal with today, where we are allowing these people who are supposed to represent us to run rampant. Is a better way to put it.
Right.
And I'm glad you were able to state that. I guess to wrap this all up, I will. We're trying to keep these under about an hour here. Do you have any final thoughts, any final words? I guess a closing statement would be the best way to put it.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to apologize for me coughing. Sorry about that. And
Oh.
I'd also like to apologize for my presentation. I'm so sorry. I wish I had known, and I would have actually made a little bit more effort than being in my my like home-based loungewear. I was like, I can do this from bed. Like, anyway. So for your listeners who are not familiar with me, have never listened, or are not cognizant of what we're doing here, my name is Kim Ruff. I am seeking the Libertarian Party's nomination for president in 2020. And the reason why I'm running is because it's so incredibly important for all of us to stand up and fight back. It's so incredibly important that we have somebody who's a representative of our beliefs, as our standard bearer, can galvanize people, inspire them, motivate them, get them involved, and then always bring that attention and energy and enthusiasm and drive it down to the local and state level, where we have awesome down ballot candidates who are running for office that they can absolutely achieve and affect positive change. We have awesome activists who are pushing back at their local or state level, because that's really where government is affecting you the most, is on those levels. And that's where you can make the biggest difference. And remind people the value of the individual and the value of community relationships, and why it's so critically important that we end up creating that safety net away from government so that we can be better people. So if you're interested in learning more about me or the campaign, you can find out about us at ruffphillips2020.com. We also are on Facebook at Kim Ruff/John Phillips for POTUS and VPOTUS in 2020. It's a mouthful, but you can find it. And we have Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, Pinterest, and several other social media platforms. And yeah, and so you can learn more about us there. And I hope if you are planning on being a delegate, we'll see you in Austin. And if you're not being a delegate, I hope at the very minimum you do stay active and involved, because we need all hands on deck.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming on the show. It's absolutely awesome to kick off this POTUS series with you, and I'm very excited to see exactly what goes on. Hopefully, I will see you at the national convention, as long as everything goes well, and we'll have some fun out there in Dallas, or Austin. Wow, Dallas.
We're going to drive to Dallas, have some fun, and then drive back.
Anyway, so with the Liberty Talks podcast, I'm Henry Conley, awaken the voice of liberty.